I used to think an orphanage was made of walls and rules, but it was really made of noise. Crying that turned into sniffling. Sniffling that turned into laughter. And laughter that turned into trouble the moment adults looked away. If you asked the director who the trouble belonged to, she would point at me with the tired affection people reserve for storms that keep returning on schedule. My name in that place was Lark, because I never stopped talking, and because I had a talent for making even the quietest rooms feel crowded. The older kids called me a radio with no off switch. The younger kids called me their hero when I told the bullies the truth in creative vocabulary. The director called me a liability, and then, in the same breath, called me brave. I was 6 when she escorted me to the reception room after I made 3 toddlers sob by insisting their toy train was, in fact, a tragic vehicle of destiny that would never reach the station because the station was an illusion. She pinched the bridge of her nose like she wanted to pinch my mouth shut too, and she whispered, "Please, just once, behave like a normal child." I tried to nod, but my lips were already forming sentences, because my brain had learned early that silence was dangerous and narration was armor. In the reception room, a young couple stood holding hands like a promise they were afraid might slip. They looked too clean for our world. Soft coats, careful smiles, eyes that kept flicking toward the hallway, as if they expected someone important to appear. The woman crouched to my height, her perfume smelling like oranges and fresh paper. "Hello," she said gently. "We heard you can talk for hours." I beamed, because being praised for my biggest flaw felt like winning a strange lottery. The man cleared his throat, a nervous sound disguised as authority. "We have a son," he said. "He doesn't speak much. He gets overwhelmed. We want someone who won't be hurt by silence." The director's voice softened as she delivered the warning she always delivered, the one that sounded like a spell meant to keep children from being returned like defective products. "If you take a child from here," she said, "do not bring them back." The couple nodded quickly, like people nodding at weather. The woman brushed my hair back with careful fingers. "Silence means you can talk to him as long as you want," she told me, as if she were handing me a key. "He won't think you're annoying." My heart thumped so hard I felt it in my teeth. A person who couldn't get tired of me sounded less like a child and more like a miracle. They drove me to a house with a garden that looked too polite to be real, and a second-floor room with a door that stayed shut like it was guarding a secret. My new parents stood behind me on the landing with faces full of hope they tried to keep from spilling. "That's Rowan's room," my new mother said softly. "He doesn't like surprises. He doesn't like strangers. But he's kind, and he's lonely." My new father added, "If you can get him to answer you just once, we'll agree to any condition you want." I had never been offered bargaining power before, so I immediately decided to become a professional negotiator. I marched to the door, took a heroic breath, and knocked with the confidence of a tiny dictator. "Hey," I shouted. The door slammed from the inside like it had a temper of its own. I stared at it, blinking, because I had expected words to be stronger than wood. I tried again with a new opening line, because I believed the universe could be hacked with synonyms. "Dear brother," I called. The door slammed again. "Respected elder sibling," slam. "Mighty warrior of the upstairs realm," slam. By the 7th slam, I was offended on behalf of all doors. The next morning, while my parents watched from the stairs with the solemn anticipation of people observing an experiment, I carried a screwdriver like a sword. I removed the door handle with the focus of a tiny engineer. The door surrendered, and I pushed it open with triumph that smelled faintly of metal. Inside, a boy sat on a bed reading a book, as if the pages were more breathable than air. He was beautiful in the way statues are beautiful. Sharp lines, stillness, distance. He did not look up. He simply existed in a quiet bubble that refused to pop. I stepped closer, ignoring the way the room felt like a museum of personal boundaries. "Hi," I said brightly. "I'm Lark, and I live here now. And I'm going to tell you stories until you realize I'm not dangerous." Rowan's fingers paused on the page. Then he closed the book and placed it down with deliberate, silent resistance, as if saying, "Without words, I can still refuse." I grinned, because refusal was at least a reaction, and reactions meant my existence had reached him. I sat on the floor, hugged his stuffed crocodile that he had left near the pillow like a comfort he refused to admit, and I began. At the orphanage, I told stories to dolls, to chairs, to the ceiling stains that looked like continents, because stories kept me from noticing hunger and kept me from hearing my own fear. Now I told stories to a boy who wouldn't answer, and the difference mattered more than I expected. When I was 3, I said, The director found me outside a clinic with a broken arm. She said I was lucky because if she hadn't seen me, I might have grown up to be a loud cripple with an attitude problem. Rowan's gaze stayed on the blanket, but his fingertips twitched like a moth bumping against light. At the orphanage, the kids played coronation. I continued. They made a throne from stacked buckets and declared one kid the king. Then they made me kneel and clean everything because apparently in their empire even the court jester had to mop. I told him I had called the fake king a fake eunuch and predicted history would forget his bloodline. And I said it with pride because my mouth had always been my fist. Rowan's shoulder moved, a tiny quake that might have been laughter trying to exist without permission. I leaned in like a detective who had spotted a clue. "See?" I whispered. "Your face knows humor. It's just hiding." Rowan's eyes flicked toward me for half a second before retreating again. Victory tasted like dust and candy at once. Over the next weeks, I learned that Rowan hated sudden noises, bright lights, crowded rooms, and being touched without warning. I learned he loved patterns, astronomy books, and the way the garden wind moved the bamboo like careful applause. I learned he flinched when adults raised their voices even if they weren't angry, and he clenched his hands until his knuckles blanched when strangers looked at him too long. I also learned he could listen forever, because listening was his shelter, and because my voice, for reasons I did not deserve, did not hurt him. At night I crawled onto the edge of his bed like an invasive cat and told him warped fairy tales, because I had never trusted the original versions to protect anyone. Little Red went to see her grandmother, I declared, and when she found the wolf, she negotiated a ceasefire using snacks and insults. Rowan pushed my forehead back once, like he was trying to keep my imagination from leaking onto his pillow. I laughed quietly and promised to keep my stories less explosive, which was a lie I kept trying to improve. The first time Rowan followed me out of his room, my parents reacted like they had seen a comet. Rowan stood at the doorway, shoulders rigid, gaze low, as if the living room were an ocean and he had forgotten how to swim. I walked backward in front of him, talking constantly as if my words could form stepping stones. "This is the sofa," I said. "It's soft, but it will judge you if you sit too stiff. This is the kitchen, which is where I will demand snacks with the dignity of a citizen." Rowan took one step, then another. After dinner, my mother presented a mountain of gifts meant for me, because adults like to buy gratitude. The pile was pink and fluffy and aggressively cheerful. I stared at it, then realized none of it looked like it belonged to Rowan, and yet Rowan was the reason I was here. So I shoved a small pouch into his hand while he wasn't looking, because stealth was my only advanced skill. "For you," I said. Rowan wiped his palm on his sleeve again and again, not to insult me but to erase sensation. "Sorry," I said quickly. "I forgot your skin has rules." Rowan's eyes lifted, startled, because most people treated his reactions like stubbornness instead of neurology. When my parents planned a shopping trip to celebrate my enrollment in school, they hesitated at the stairs. "Rowan won't come," my father said quietly. "Crowds make him panic." I looked up at the balcony where Rowan stood alone, hands clenched, gaze fixed on a point beyond the garden like he was trying to outstare anxiety. "Then I'm not going either," I said. "I need him to know he's not optional." That night Rowan sat beside me on the sofa, not touching, but close enough that I could feel his presence like warmth from a lamp. I told him a story about a knight who refused to leave his dragon behind just because the village feared flames. Rowan's breathing slowed, and I understood. Sometimes staying was the loudest gift. School began like a drumbeat, loud, repetitive, impossible to ignore. I was small, fast, and fearless in the way children are fearless when they haven't yet learned what consequences cost. Rowan was older by 2 grades, brilliant on paper, fragile in crowds, and visibly different in ways bullies could smell. On Rowan's first day back in a classroom, he turned pale at the gate, hands fluttering near his chest like trapped birds. I grabbed his wrist gently, announced every movement before I made it, and walked him through the entrance with my voice as our shield. Then the insults arrived. "Freak," one boy muttered. "He walks like a puppet. Look at his hands." Rowan's breathing hitched. My anger rose like a firework. I stepped in front of him and pointed at the loudest boy. "Congratulations," I said. "Your mouth is a landfill, and you're proud of it." I bought us matching wrist communicators with my parents' help, a device with a call button and GPS disguised as a cheerful watch. "If anything happens," I told Rowan, "press this, and I will appear like a superhero with questionable manners." That afternoon, my watch vibrated during the last class. I answered and heard shouting. On the sports field, a cluster of older boys surrounded Rowan and tried to tear off his watch like it was his lifeline. Rowan did not scream. He held his arms close, eyes wide, jaw clenched, enduring as if endurance were his only language. I threw my backpack down, grabbed a training bat, and charged with all the wrath a small body can contain. Teachers arrived, parents were called, the principal's office filled with accusations and trembling. I played the recording from my watch. Their insults, their threats, their cruelty captured in clean audio. The adults went quiet. My father's voice dropped into a dangerous calm. "You will apologize," he said to the school leadership, "and you will fix this, because I don't fund institutions that normalize violence." That night, under a blanket fort on Rowan's floor, I whispered, "You did nothing wrong." Rowan stared at me for a long time, and then his lips moved. The sound that came out was not a full sentence. It was 3 clipped syllables, the kind of phrase you could use to push away the world without opening yourself to it. "You're ridiculous," Rowan said, voice hoarse like a door that had never been opened. I froze, then burst into silent laughter so intense my stomach hurt. "You talked," I hissed, Rowan's eyebrows knit together in confusion at my joy. I asked him to say it again, and he did, and my heart felt too big for my ribs. After that, the phrase became his shield reply to my chaos. And yet it warmed over time, because context can soften even the sharpest edges. I built routines with him. School, therapy, quiet hours, story hours, garden walks, and a weekly trip to the bookstore, where I could talk while he touched book spines like they were safe code. One evening, my watch buzzed with an unknown number. The director from the orphanage was calling. He told me someone claimed to be my biological parents. My stomach dipped. I looked at Rowan across the room, watching me with alert eyes, because he could read shifts in emotion the way he read constellations. That night I lay awake and listened to the house breathe. And I wondered whether destiny was about to knock the door off its hinges again. The visitors arrived with practiced tears and expensive shoes. They hugged me like actors hugging a lost child for the cameras, and they told me they had searched for years, and they called me by a name I didn't recognize as mine. They insisted on taking me for a short trip to reconnect. In the car, their smiles stayed fixed, and their conversation felt like a script written by someone who didn't know my personality, only my function. They confiscated my phone with a gentle joke about reducing screen time. The highway stretched ahead, then narrowed into mountain roads where cell signals died. In the back seat, I kept my wrist turned just enough to see the watch under my sleeve. At a bend where the car slowed, I shoved the door open and threw myself out, rolling down a slope into thorny grass. Pain exploded in my ribs, but fear kept me moving. As dusk thickened, the forest grew loud with insects and distant animal cries. A beam of light cut through the trees. Footsteps approached, steady, urgent. "Lark," Rowan's voice said, and my name sounded new in his mouth. "You're ridiculous." I burst from the brush and collided with him. Rowan stiffened, then hugged back, one arm tight, the other trembling as he tried to tolerate the flood of sensation for my sake. Police arrived later, alerted by the watch's emergency ping and by my father's calls. The visitors were detained and unmasked as recruiters for a trafficking scheme that used fake reunions as bait. At home, Rowan sat beside me while my mother cleaned my cuts, and my father signed paperwork with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Rowan did not speak much, but he stayed close, eyes locked on me like he was guarding the only star he trusted. Later that night, Rowan sat at the edge of my bed and said, very slowly, "Don't go." "I wasn't planning to," I whispered. He stared at his hands, then added, "Not sister." I frowned, confused, and decided to file the sentence away for a future version of me who would know what to do with it. For now, I took his hand with permission and said, "Okay. Not sister. Still family." Rowan's fingers tightened like a vow. After that, our lives widened slowly, carefully, like eyes adjusting to light. Rowan learned to ask before touching, learned to breathe through crowds with headphones, learned to speak to strangers in short practiced scripts. I learned to slow down, to narrate less when he needed quiet, to tell him my feelings without turning them into jokes, to respect that his world was built from sensory math. A university overseas offered Rowan a place in a program that combined neuroscience research with adaptive learning design because he wanted to build systems that didn't punish people for difference. My parents asked if I would go too, not as a sacrifice but as a choice. Rowan spoke first, voice steady enough to shock us both. "I will teach her," he said. So we went. The new country smelled like coffee and rain. I struggled with the language, But Rowan practiced with me each night, patient in a way he had never been with anyone else. In return, I told him softer stories before sleep. Stories where the wolf gets therapy and the princess chooses solitude and the dragon learns consent. Rowan would roll his eyes and whisper, "Ridiculous." But his hand would find mine in the dark, and I would understand the word had become his version of "I'm here." On a winter evening when the snow fell like slow applause, Rowan met me outside my dorm with a scarf he had knitted badly and refused to admit he had made. "I don't like surprises," he said, "but I need to say this." He took a breath the way people take a leap. "You are my safest thing," he said. "When you leave, my world tilts. When you come back, it levels. I want the future with you inside it." I wanted to make a joke, because jokes had always been my shield, but the moment deserved honesty. "Then we build it," I said. "We did not become a fairy tale. We became two people who knew what abandonment costs and chose, over and over, not to pay that price to anyone else." Years later, I made a documentary about children who age out of care systems and how predators exploit their longing for roots. Rowan designed an app that helped neurodivergent students communicate needs to teachers without shame. Sometimes I still woke from nightmares where I was rolling down a hill alone with no signal. When that happened, Rowan would sit up, press his forehead to mine with permission, and say, "You're safe." I would answer, "You're safe too," and we would both believe it, not because destiny promised it, but because we built it with choices, boundaries, and a stubborn refusal to return anyone we loved. After the police case, my mother started volunteering at a shelter that supported exploited children. She came home each night carrying a new kind of focused anger, not the frantic kind that burns out, but the steady kind that learns names, fills forms, and refuses to let harm stay anonymous. The first week she sorted, donated clothes. The second week she sat with a girl who wouldn't make eye contact and read the shelter rules out loud like they were a contract the world owed her. My mother's hands shook sometimes when she locked the front door, and she stopped apologizing for that tremor. My father, who used to believe protection meant money and distance, learned a slower bravery. He sat through trainings, apologized when his stress sharpened his voice, and practiced asking Rowan what the room felt like before he asked him what the room required. Rowan never healed in a straight line. A calm week could collapse after one sudden alarm or one crowded corridor, and we stopped treating retreat as failure. We treated it as strategy, an exit plan that worked. In therapy, Rowan learned to name sensations instead of fighting them too bright, too loud, too fast, and once he could name them, he could request changes without shame. Because he preferred precision to performance, he began writing more than speaking, and we built our own small language, notes, symbols, and short scripts that let him communicate needs without pressure. I had always believed narration was armor, but I learned that fewer words can be a kind of mercy. When the trafficking recruiters were prosecuted, the case moved with the sluggish cruelty of systems that ask survivors to keep proving they were hurt. I sat in courtrooms and listened to lawyers argue about timelines, as if time were the only thing that mattered. And I realized that surviving is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of paperwork. My parents took turns attending hearings, so I didn't have to be alone with the questions, and Rowan came once, headphones on, notebook in his lap, eyes fixed on me like a lighthouse that refused to blink. Afterward he wrote, in careful block letters, "I hate rooms that expect pain to be polite," and I laughed once, sharp and grateful, because it was the truest summary anyone had offered. When we moved overseas for university, the new country smelled like coffee and rain and laundry soap that wasn't ours yet. I struggled with the language at first, translating my jokes in my head and discovering that humor does not always survive customs. Rowan practiced with me each night anyway, patient in a way he had never been with anyone else. In return, I told him softer stories before sleep, stories where the wolf gets therapy, the princess chooses solitude, and the dragon learns consent. Rowan would roll his eyes and mutter, "Ridiculous," but his hand would find mine in the dark, and I learned that the word had become his version of "I'm here." Campus life tried to overwhelm him the way crowded hallways once had, so we made routines like scaffolding. The same quiet cafe table at the same hour, the same route home, a small emergency kit in his bag, and rules about leaving early before leaving turned into panic. We found a therapist who understood sensory math and didn't treat his boundaries like stubbornness, and Rowan learned that describing the world accurately is not an attitude problem. I joined a student media lab because cameras made sense to me. You frame what matters, You choose what you refuse to normalize, and you learn that focus is a kind of ethics. Rowan joined a research group that combined neuroscience with learning design because he wanted to build systems that didn't punish people for difference. In our second semester, a professor asked Rowan to present in front of a crowded hall without accommodations. Rowan froze, his fingers fluttering near his chest like trapped birds, and the old fear rose in me like firework smoke. But Rowan did not ask me to fight for him. He asked me, through a note, to stand beside him. So I did. I told the professor, politely and clearly, what accommodations were needed, and when the professor scoffed, Rowan wrote a sentence on the board in the steadiness of his own hand. Access is not a favor. And he walked out. The room went silent. The professor looked offended. I looked proud. Later, Rowan admitted that leaving felt like falling. I told him leaving can also be a landing. We spent that winter building his app as a class project that became a real tool. It was simple on purpose. Students could select needs, lower lighting, written instructions, extra time, a quiet corner, and send them to teachers without a dramatic conversation. Rowan insisted the design avoid pity. He wanted it to look like a normal option, not a confession. The first time a teacher emailed him to say a student stopped skipping class because the classroom no longer felt like an ambush, Rowan stared at the screen as if he didn't trust good news. Then he wrote, quietly, "Maybe the world can be taught." I started my documentary slowly, almost by accident, because the topic kept finding me. A girl in one of my classes mentioned she had aged out of care and had no one to call when she got sick. Another student described a cousin who disappeared after replying to a message from someone claiming to be family. Every story had the same shape, longing turned into leverage. I remembered the orphanage director's warning, "Do not bring them back," and I realized the warning was both love and fear. Love for the child, fear of the system that treats children like returns. I pitched the documentary as a map, not a tragedy. My advisor asked if I wanted a dramatic ending. I told her I wanted an honest one. We interviewed social workers, lawyers, foster parents, and survivors who had learned to recognize manipulation the way you recognize smoke. One survivor told me, "If you want to show truth, show the small choices that keep you alive, locking a door, texting a friend, walking away before you feel brave." And I did. While I filmed, my mother expanded her volunteering into advocacy. She helped the shelter create a resource binder that was actually readable, with steps that didn't assume you already had a safe adult. My father used his money differently too. Not as a spotlight, but as a quiet lever. He funded a legal clinic that helped survivors file restraining orders and navigate reports without being humiliated. And he did it without putting his name on the door. He told me he was embarrassed it had taken him so long to learn that generosity can be silent. I told him learning late is still learning. We visited the orphanage once during a summer break. The hallway smelled the same disinfectant, cheap soup, and childhood held together with rules. The director looked older, more tired, and when she saw me, she tried to keep her face professional, but her eyes softened in a way that made my throat tighten. Rowan stood beside me, shoulders rigid, and I introduced him the way I meant it. "This is Rowan, and he is my family." The director nodded as if she had expected that sentence and been waiting years to hear it. I donated funds for new bedding and a quiet room for kids who needed lower noise, and Rowan quietly explained how to set up a corner with headphones and visual schedules. When a little boy kept hovering near Rowan, fascinated by his calm, Rowan handed him a small notebook and wrote, "You can use this to say things without saying them." The boy hugged the notebook to his chest like it was a treasure. On the way out, the director said, "I thought you would be returned, and I hate that I thought that." I told her, the fear was reasonable, the hope is allowed too. Back at university, my documentary cut became a living thing. A timeline, a web, a set of warnings that didn't turn survivors into spectacle. In the editing room, I removed scenes that were too painful to be useful, and kept scenes that taught viewers what to do when their gut said something was wrong. The final chapter was not a rescue. It was a list of exits, and the sentence I wanted every kid like me to hear. "You are not selfish for wanting to live." Rowan, meanwhile, kept iterating his app. He added an option for teachers to confirm accommodations in writing so promises couldn't evaporate. He built a mode that translated needs into multiple languages, because he remembered my early days overseas with my jokes trapped behind vocabulary. When a student wrote him to say the app made them feel less alone, Rowan closed his laptop, stared at the ceiling, and whispered, "Ridiculous," as if the world had handed him a miracle and he didn't know where to put it. I learned, slowly, to stop using jokes as an emergency exit when feelings got too real. Rowan learned, slowly, to let touch be a choice he could accept, not an invasion he had to endure. We practiced consent like a daily language. Can I sit closer? Do you want the lights lower? Do you want to talk? Or do you want quiet? It was not romantic in the way movies sell romance, but it was intimate in a way movies rarely understand. On quiet nights, we sat outside and identified constellations. Rowan described them like math. I described them like drama, and both versions were true, because truth can be both map and story. When winter came and my nightmares returned, thorns, darkness, the snap of a car door, the moment the signal dies, Rowan would press his forehead to mine, with permission, and count breaths with me. We made a rule. No one has to be brave alone. After graduation, we did not rush into a perfect life. We rented a small apartment with a balcony for plants and a second room that Rowan could retreat into when the world got loud. I worked with a nonprofit that trained schools to recognize grooming tactics and respond without blaming kids. Rowan joined a lab that tested learning environments for sensory barriers, then insisted they publish guidelines in plain language, not just journals. My mother kept volunteering, but she also started training other volunteers, teaching them that kindness without structure can still harm. My father kept showing up at hearings, at fundraisers, at boring committee meetings, until boring became proof of commitment. The documentary premiered at a small festival. After the screening, a young person approached me with shaking hands and said, "I thought I was dramatic for being scared, and now I think I was just paying attention." I told them paying attention is how you survive. Rowan stood behind me, not touching, but close enough that I could feel his presence like warmth from a lamp. He wrote one sentence on a note card and slipped it into my hand. "You turned the trap into a map." I cried, which embarrassed me, which made him sigh, which made me laugh through it anyway. In the first year after we settled, I kept expecting danger to return wearing a new costume. If a stranger lingered too long near the building, my pulse jumped. If a message arrived from an unknown number, my hands went cold. Rowan noticed before I spoke, because he had learned to read my body the way he read patterns in the sky. He wrote, "We can check together." And that sentence became our ritual. We checked, we verified, we exhaled, and we moved on. My work at the nonprofit pulled me into rooms full of people who liked simple narratives. They wanted monsters and heroes, clean endings and applause. I kept insisting on the uncomfortable middle, the part where a child is unsure, where an adult must be patient, where institutions must do boring tasks correctly. A conference organizer asked me to speak about resilience, and I told her I would speak about logistics instead. She laughed like I was joking. I wasn't. On stage, I described the watch on my wrist as a lifeline disguised as a toy, the police report as a document that should have been easier to file, and the moment a teacher chose to intervene as the difference between a bad day and a scar that lasts decades. After the talk, a school counselor approached with wet eyes and said she had never realized how often adults ask children to be the calmest person in the room. I told her adults should carry the calm, and children should be allowed to be children. Rowan's app grew beyond our expectations. A district adopted it as part of an accessibility pilot, then another did, and Rowan's inbox filled with messages that were not praise but proof. A student who finally asked for written instructions, a teacher who realized fluorescent lights can be pain, a principal who stopped calling accommodations special treatment. The success scared Rowan at first, because attention feels like a spotlight, and spotlights used to mean danger. So we built boundaries around the work. No interviews without prepared questions. No photos without consent. No public speaking unless Rowan chose it and had an exit route. When a journalist tried to frame his story as an inspirational miracle, Rowan wrote back, "I am not inspiration, I am information," and the journalist surprisingly published that sentence as is. My documentary did well enough to attract a streaming inquiry. The producer wanted to dramatize the forest scene, to add suspense music and slow-motion shots of my bruised hands. I told him the most suspenseful part was the moment my phone was taken with a smile, because that is how traps work, politely, he argued. I walked away. Later, in the kitchen, I shook with anger and old fear, and Rowan handed me a note that said, "Leaving is a landing," the same sentence I had offered him years ago. We learned, in small, humiliating ways, that advocacy invites backlash. A stranger emailed me, accusing me of exaggerating, as if trauma needed a rubric to be valid. Another person called my mother a busybody for helping at the shelter. My father received letters suggesting he was funding misbehavior. We saved everything, because paper trails protect the quiet. We also refused to let hate become our daily weather. Some weekends we did nothing that could be measured. We cooked noodles, rearranged books, watched a ridiculous show, and let the ordinary prove that the past did not own every hour. In late summer, we visited the river again. Rowan brought a telescope this time, the kind that folds into a case like it's keeping its wonder private. We lay on a blanket and watched the Perseids streak overhead. I narrated every shooting star as a dramatic omen, and Rowan corrected my astronomy with patient annoyance, and I loved him for caring enough to correct me. At one point he said, softly, "I can't promise the world won't hurt you." Then he added, "I can promise I'll notice." That promise, small and specific, steadied me more than any grand vow. My mother began mentoring new volunteers at the shelter. She taught them how to ask questions without interrogation, how to offer choices without pressure, how to keep children's stories private even when curiosity feels righteous. My father, quietly, started funding sensory-friendly rooms in public libraries because he had watched Rowan find peace between shelves. When he told me, he looked embarrassed, as if tenderness were something he had learned late and was still unsure how to carry. I told him tenderness is a skill too. Once, a school invited me for a workshop, Rowan for a meeting with educators. In the parking lot, Rowan's hands fluttered, and he considered turning back. He wrote, "If I go in, stay close." Inside, he did not give a speech. He handed out a one-page guide with bullet points. Reduce surprise, offer written options, respect headphones, never punish a meltdown as defiance. A teacher raised her hand and asked, "What if students take advantage?" Rowan looked at me, and then wrote, "What if you give them dignity and they use it to live?" The room went quiet. Afterward, as we walked out into sunlight, he said aloud 2 words, clear as a bell, not optional. I laughed until my chest hurt. That night we celebrated with dumplings and cheap cake, because our family did not need expensive rituals to feel real. In the 3rd year, the shelter launched a hotline staffed by trained volunteers and social workers. My mother took the first shift. When she came home afterward, her face looked older and stronger at once. She said, "I heard a child ask if it was their fault." Then she said, "I told them no. And I meant it so hard I felt it in my bones." We sat at the kitchen table, all 4 of us, my parents, Rowan, and me holding mugs of tea like anchors. No one made jokes. No one forced optimism. We simply stayed in the same room and let that be a kind of repair. Somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary work, Rowan and I stopped thinking of ourselves as survivors waiting for the next test. We became adults making choices. Which jobs to accept, which invitations to decline, which friendships to build, which boundaries to defend. We learned that safety is not a trophy you win once. It is maintenance, like watering plants, like changing locks, like telling the truth out loud when someone tries to shrink it. And when the old fear returned, as it sometimes did, it arrived to find us surrounded not by applause, but by structure. There were still questions I could not answer neatly. I never learned who left me outside that clinic with a broken arm, and some nights the not knowing felt like a pebble in my shoe that no amount of walking could smooth. A detective once suggested we might identify the original abandonment through old records. I tried for a month, filled out forms, waited for replies, and then realized I was chasing a door that might never open. Rowan watched me stack paperwork like it was a fort, and he wrote, "You can stop without losing," and I let myself stop. I did not owe my past an explanation in order to deserve my present. Sometimes the shelter asked me to speak with teens who had been contacted by strangers claiming to be relatives. I never told them to trust nobody. I told them to trust process, verify identities through agencies, insist on public meetings, keep a friend informed, never surrender your phone, never let politeness outrank safety. I explained that predators are not always loud. They are often charming, and charm is not proof. A boy with a shaved head listened and then asked, "What if the stranger really is my family?" I said, "Then your family will respect your boundaries. Because love that argues with your safety is not love, it is appetite." The boy nodded slowly like he was memorizing a survival spell. At home, Rowan and I practiced our own boundaries with the same seriousness we gave our work. We had a rule about disagreements. No sarcasm as a weapon. No silence as punishment. No disappearing without a note. Rowan didn't like surprises, so I learned to announce changes, the way you announce weather. Gently, early, with options. I didn't like feeling trapped, so Rowan learned to ask, Do you want a plan, or do you want a door? And somehow he always knew which one I needed. Once, after a long week of meetings, he came home with a paper bag and set it on the table like an offering. Inside were 2 scarves, one knitted badly, one bought, and a note that said, "Choose which one feels right today." I laughed, because it was such a Rowan solution. Affection with a menu. Another time, I woke from a nightmare and found him sitting on the floor beside the bed, back against the wall, counting silently on his fingers. He looked up when I opened my eyes and said, "I heard you move." No poetry, no speeches, just presence. And my chest unclenched. We hosted small dinners for friends from the lab and the nonprofit, but we kept the guest list short and the lights soft. Rowan prepared a quiet room with blankets and a sign that said, "Rest is allowed," because he believed permission matters. When one guest scoffed at the sign, I watched Rowan's jaw tighten. Before I could snap, Rowan slid a note toward the guest. "If you mock rest, you can leave." The guest stopped scoffing. The sign stayed. My parents visited once a year, sometimes twice. My mother brought oranges and a new binder of shelter resources, and she asked Rowan's consent before she hugged him, which always made him blink like she had offered a gift. My father cooked more than he talked, as if chopping vegetables could repair old mistakes, and maybe it could. One evening my father said quietly, "I used to think you were saving Rowan, and now I see Rowan saved you too." I wanted to deny it out of habit, but the truth was simple. Rowan taught me that being loud is not the only way to exist, and I taught him that being different is not a reason to be alone. When the nonprofit offered me a promotion that would move us to a different city, I panicked at the idea of new streets and new risks. Rowan made a list. He always made lists. He wrote pros, cons, escapes, and then he wrote the last word bigger than the others. We visited the city for a weekend, tested routes, found a quiet park, located the nearest police station, and sat in a cafe to see if Rowan could breathe there. He could. I could too. So we moved again, not because fate demanded it, but because we chose it with eyes open. The new apartment had thicker walls. The new neighborhood had a community center. Rowan started running a monthly workshop for teachers on accessibility, and he always ended with the same sentence, spoken aloud now, practiced and steady. Dignity is a design choice. I filmed a follow-up series for my documentary short clips that taught specific safety steps without sensational stories. It reached foster care groups, school boards, and one exhausted aunt who emailed me to say she had finally learned what questions to ask when a stranger called. These were not awards you could hold, but they were impacts you could feel. And in the middle of all that work, Rowan surprised me in the only way he would ever consider acceptable. He scheduled it, he warned me a day in advance, and he still managed to make it feel like a miracle. He asked if I wanted to make our partnership legally official paperwork, hospital rights, shared keys, the boring protections adults pretend they don't need. I said yes, because boring protections were exactly what we had earned. We signed papers at a small office. No guests, no speeches. Afterward, we bought dumplings and ate them on a bench, and Rowan said, softly, "Not sister, still family," as if he were closing the circle he had opened years ago. I leaned my head against his shoulder with permission, and we watched people walk past without noticing us. And I realized anonymity can be a gift. Years passed in the ordinary way. Years pass. Grocery lists on the fridge, therapy appointments in neat blocks, a quiet room prepared before guests arrive, friends learning to knock and wait. Rowan's progress still bent sometimes. My grief still visited. My mouth still wanted to turn everything into a story. But our life stopped feeling like a test. We built safety as a habit. Documentation when needed, boundaries when needed, community when needed, rest whenever possible. I kept a notebook of stories, but I stopped turning fairy tales into explosions. I turned them into exits. In every version, the frightened character gets a friend, a map, and the right to leave. If you asked me now what my name was, I would still answer Lark because my voice survived, and I would add, without joking this time, that Rowan heard it and stayed, and that, in the end, was the plot we wrote ourselves.